Life on the outskirts of the town had always been calm and measured. I lived in an old farmhouse that was once filled with children and laughter. Now, in solitude, I had grown accustomed to the silence and isolation. The pine forest seemed to embrace my plot of land, and the river, lazily flowing across the road, always felt so close, as though it were speaking to me with its soft whisper. These simple, seemingly unnoticed things, the sunlight filtering through the pine needles, the scent of fresh pine, the distant calls of birds, formed my world. In the mornings, I often sat on the old wooden porch, holding a cup of hot coffee. I loved watching the light touch the leaves, creating patterns on the ground and thinking about how I had everything I needed for happiness: peace, nature, comfort. But this morning was different. I didn't hear the sound of the car right away. A faint rumble that gradually grew louder, and then, finally, a car stopped at the driveway. A strange sound, out of place in this quiet spot. The car was unfamiliar. I stood up and moved away from the porch, trying to see who it was. When I saw who was getting out, I didn't immediately recognize him. It was my nephew Jacob, but he had changed. Time had not passed in vain. He was different, older, a grown man. We hadn't seen each other in 5 years, and back then he was still a teenager. But now, standing before me, was a man with a serious look, struggling to conceal the tension. "Hi, Kate," he said, as if he hadn't expected to meet me here, as if this place were not his home. His voice sounded different, quiet, slightly distant. "Been in town long?" I asked as he crossed the threshold. "No, just arrived," Jacob replied. His face was serious, as if he were hiding some thought, some secret. I didn't ask any questions, as everything was too sudden. I didn't even understand why his visit was affecting me so much. I led him to the dining table, offered him tea, but there was a heaviness in my heart. This unexpected guest was not a part of my little world, yet it seemed he had come to change something. I tried not to show how surprised I was by his arrival. Jacob had always been unusual, but now he was even more withdrawn than before. He sat down at the table, took a cup of tea, but his gaze wandered around the room, stopping on the old photographs hanging on the walls. When he lingered on one of the pictures, I noticed how his face changed, as if the memories had taken over. That was the moment I realized he hadn't just happened to stumble here by chance. "How are you, Aunt Kate?" he asked after a long pause, trying to steer the conversation back to normal. "I'm fine. Everything's just the same as it was. You know this house doesn't change, Jacob," I replied, trying to ease the tension. After dinner, we each went to our rooms. I offered him the guest room as usual, and he thanked me. When the door to his room closed behind him, I sat down on the couch and thought, what had brought him here? Why hadn't he warned me about his visit? And most importantly, what was he hoping to find in this house, among old memories and forgotten things? That night, those questions kept me awake. I lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night, the rustling of the leaves, the distant murmur of the river. Thoughts kept coming and going in my mind, but none of them gave me peace. Everything about this visit felt strange, not like before. He was different, and I couldn't understand why he needed to come back here. The next morning, when I descended into the kitchen, Jacob was already sitting at the table finishing his coffee. He was alone, as always, absorbed in his thoughts. There was still a hint of confusion in his gaze, as though he were trying to piece together fragments of something long lost, but couldn't find the right piece. I decided I needed to break the heavy air that hung in the room a little. I thought maybe we could take a walk in the forest. You've always liked walking there, I suggested, hoping that it might help him relax, even just a little. The forest was nearby, always calm, as if it protected us from the outside world. You probably don't read books like this anymore, Aunt, he said, thoughtfully stroking the cover. You used to read them yourself, I replied, trying to hide my growing unease. Yeah, I remember, but now everything seems so different. We walked outside in silence and headed into the forest. Jacob walked beside me, but something in his gait revealed an inner struggle. He often slowed down, as if trying to grasp something that kept slipping away from him. Along the way, we silently walked the familiar paths. I showed him the places where we used to play as children, where we hid from the rain under the wide branches of trees, where we saw foxes and rabbits. And then we came to the large oak tree, old and wise, which had always drawn attention. Jacob stopped in front of it, stared at the bark, and I noticed how his face grew even more tense. He didn't speak right away, instead running his fingers over the initials carved into the tree. I remembered those letters. It had been so long ago when we were children, and we carved our first markings into the trees, as signs that this place belonged only to us. "Did you do these?" he asked, not looking away from the initials. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Yes, that was a long time ago." He thought for a moment, and I felt how his mind was pulling him somewhere into the past. Perhaps it was the moment when he began to realize that many things he had thought were forgotten still lived deep in his memory. He was here, but he felt something slipping away from him, as though this place, these moments, were connected to something more important than just childhood games. "This place, it was always special for us," he said quietly. I didn't argue. We both fell silent, each absorbed in our own thoughts. At that moment, I understood that his visit was not just a coincidence. He hadn't come simply to look at old things or reminisce about childhood. He was searching for something that could help him understand what had happened in his life, why he had ended up in this place, and what he should do next. The next morning, I woke up early, as always, despite the restless night. I went to the pantry to grab some extra supplies for the kitchen and, almost automatically, began tidying up among the old things that hadn't been used in a long time. It was a process I was used to. I often visited there, rearranging and shifting items as though they could bring back forgotten moments. And then, among the boxes of books and old newspapers, on a shelf I rarely touched, I noticed something strange. A backpack. It was slightly open, as if someone had hurriedly placed it down and forgotten to close it. I couldn't remember when Jacob had brought it here. He hadn't had it with him when we went for our walk in the forest. Curiously, I approached and peered inside the backpack. Among the scattered small items inside, I noticed a journal. It was old, battered, with a cover that had lost its color. Clearly, someone had carried it around for a long time. I didn't touch it, but this discovery sparked a chain of questions. Could it be Jacob's journal? Why had he hidden it in the backpack, as if trying to conceal it? I didn't know what to do with this find. Various theories formed in my mind, but none of them provided me with a clear answer. I remembered his gaze when we talked about the past, how he was silent and seemed unable to find the right words. Returning to the house, I still couldn't take my eyes off the journal hidden in the backpack. I couldn't understand why this simple object affected me so much. Could it be a sign? Something that could explain why Jacob had come here? Why his gaze had been so anxious? He was clearly hiding something, and I didn't know if I should continue unraveling this mystery. But his words from the evening before kept bothering me. "You've always been the one who helped me dream, Aunt Kate." Why did they sound like a farewell? Why had he suddenly spoken so openly about his feelings? I needed to know what was hidden in that journal, but I decided to wait. Maybe life itself would tell me when and how to approach the matter. After I placed the journal back on the shelf and decided not to think about it, we went out for another walk. I noticed that Jacob was increasingly interrupting our conversations, absorbed in his own thoughts. The forest was the same as before, alive and breathing, despite winter's approach and the ground being covered with a light frost. We walked along familiar paths, and I tried not to focus too much on his silence. "Do you still play the guitar?" I asked, hoping to momentarily distract him from his gloomy thoughts. He nodded, but there was something hidden in his gaze. "Not as often, mostly when I need to get rid of something inside." It became clear to me that Jacob was no longer the carefree boy he once was. He had grown up, become more withdrawn, with a pain in his eyes that he couldn't understand. Perhaps it was tied to his decision to leave college, as he had told me. Or maybe it was something that had happened in his life after he left our town. We reached the old bridge I remembered well from my childhood. It was wooden, covered in moss, and always brought a sense of calm to me. I stopped, trying to absorb the silence, but Jacob suddenly spoke. I don't understand why I came here. I'm not even sure what I'm looking for. I looked at him and saw how his face suddenly expressed so many emotions that it almost became painful. It was as if he wanted to say something important, but didn't know how to do it. You've always been there, Aunt Kate. When things were tough, I came to you. But now, I don't know what I want. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to figure out what to do with his words. Sometimes people need time to admit their feelings to themselves, and I felt that Jacob wasn't yet ready to acknowledge what was troubling him. We continued walking along the river, and silence once again enveloped us. At that moment, I realized that he hadn't come here simply because of nostalgia or by accident. He was searching for answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. He was trying to find something that might help him understand himself. Jacob stopped by the large oak tree and looked at the initials we had carved into it, which still remained on the bark. I noticed how his gaze became more focused, as though these simple symbols held a deeper meaning. Did you ever think we left something important here? He asked quietly. I shook my head. Number, but maybe it's just a memory. That moment when we thought everything would always be the way it was then. He silently nodded and looked at the tree again. In his eyes was a question he couldn't quite form. This moment wasn't just a walk through familiar places. It was an attempt to reclaim something lost. But what exactly was he trying to find here, in these places that had once been filled with joy and carefreeness? That day, after our walk, I suggested to Jacob that we drive into town. How about we take a stroll through the farmer's market? I asked. Sometimes a simple change of scenery can help you see the world in a different light. He agreed, though I could still sense that his thoughts were far from settled. When we arrived in town, the familiar noise and bustle of the market filled the air. The old familiar stalls with fruits, fresh vegetables, flowers, everything was just as it had always been. But Jacob looked at the people strangely, as if their everyday concerns were foreign to him. We bought apples and honey, then stopped by a small cafe where the smell of freshly brewed coffee and pastries always filled the air. I hoped that this cozy spot might lighten his mood, give him a chance to relax and talk about something simpler. Did you used to come here with your mom? I asked, setting my coffee cup on the table. I wanted to hear more about his life, his feelings, and I hoped he would be more open. We had once been close. He paused, stirring his coffee with a spoon before responding. I used to come. But now it's just not the same, Aunt Kate. His voice had become quiet, almost sad. I waited for him to continue, but he fell silent, as if unsure where to begin. I could see him caught between the past and the present. His relationship with his mother, my sister, had always been complicated. It hung in the air, but Jacob didn't seem able to bring it up. What happened? I asked carefully. I don't understand what happened between us. He finally exhaled. It's hard to talk to her, and everything I say seems like it doesn't reach her. It feels like we're drifting further and further apart. I noticed how his gaze became clouded, as if he didn't know what to say. It was so raw, so sincere, that I felt a tightness in my chest. You know, you can't judge her by her silence, I said, trying to comfort him. Everyone has their own truth, and maybe she's hiding her pain because she can't show it. But you know she's always loved you. He simply nodded, unable to respond. I could see how hard it was for him to talk about this. Sometimes the pain we carry inside doesn't just disappear. It doesn't heal in one day. And even the simplest conversations can bring out the feelings we don't want to admit. We sat in the cafe for a while longer, watching the people come and go, unaware of the inner storms that might be hidden within each of us. And though the atmosphere was calm, there were so many unspoken words in our conversation. I realized that Jacob was searching for something within himself, something that could heal him. Do you think I'll ever be able to fix things with Mom? He suddenly asked. I looked at him, trying to answer without deceiving him. Time, Jacob. Maybe time and sincerity can help you find common ground. but you have to be ready for the fact that the process might take a long time. Jacob silently nodded. He probably still didn't know how to begin this journey, but I felt that our conversation had become a small but important step for him. In that moment, I understood that this visit hadn't been a coincidence. Jacob needed to find answers, not just for himself, but for his family. That evening, I decided to make Jacob his favorite childhood dish, a pumpkin pie. When he was little, he always asked me to make it, and I was happy to fulfill that wish. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and roasted pumpkin, and the aroma spread throughout the house, giving it a cozy, warm feeling. I loved cooking for him. It reminded me of the time when he was very young, when the house was full of life and laughter. But now, despite all the coziness, there was a certain silence between us. When the pie was ready, we sat down at the table. He picked up his fork and froze, as if unsure where to start. His eyes grew restless again, as though everything happening around us was part of a larger question he couldn't seem to answer. "Do you remember how we used to play in the garden?" he asked after his first bite of pie, as if trying to find something in those memories that could help him. I smiled. "Of course I do. You used to hide behind the bushes and I could never find you. You were so fast." Jacob smiled slightly, but that smile wasn't quite like the ones from before. It was lost, as if he was trying to reclaim something that had already gone. "You were always there, Aunt Kate. When I was alone, you always found time to talk, to listen. I remember you saying that each of us has our own story, but now I don't know how to find mine." I felt his words, filled with sadness and confusion, break through the walls he had built around himself. It was a confession, and I knew that he was searching for not only answers to the questions about his life, but also confirmation that he wasn't alone in this search. "You'll find your story, Jacob. I believe that. You're not lost. Sometimes it just takes time to figure out who you are and where you're going." I said this not only for him, but also for myself. I understood that we were both at a transitional point, where everything seemed different than it used to be. But that didn't mean everything was lost. He stayed silent, and I saw how his gaze became more thoughtful. Jacob looked at me as though he wanted to say something important but didn't know how to express it. "I'm not sure I want to go back home," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "Everything feels not mine. I don't know what to do next." These words struck me deeply. I could see how he was trying to make sense of himself, as if he didn't know what to do with this path that had suddenly appeared before him. Jacob was at a crossroads, and despite his outward maturity, he was still the same boy who once sought answers to questions that were too complex for his age. "You'll find your way, Jacob. You will find it yourself. The important thing is not to be afraid to search." I said this sincerely, because I believe that each of us, at some point in life, ends up in a place where we just need to be patient and trust ourselves. He was silent again, lost in his thoughts, and I felt that this evening conversation wasn't just a talk over dinner. It was something more. We were both talking about things that can't be resolved in one day, but things that are so important to say so that they don't stay bottled up inside. And although the conversation was heavy, full of unfinished thoughts, I felt that we had taken another step forward. The next day, after Jacob and I had chatted a bit and spent some time in silence, I suggested that we work on fixing up the old bike that had been gathering dust in my garage for years. This bike was one of the first ones I had bought for his early training sessions. Time had not been kind to it. Rust covered the metal parts, and the tires were flat. But to me, it was a symbol of the time when Jacob was still a teenager, trying to fix things on his own, even though not always successfully. "Do you still remember how you taught me to ride?" Jacob asked as he climbed into the garage. He smiled, but there was a wistful undertone to his smile. "Of course I remember. You rode like a maniac. I remember how we both fell into the ditch because you tried to speed up so much." He chuckled softly, and I noticed his face soften just a little. He got to work on the bike, removing the rusted parts and inspecting them like a skilled mechanic. "I used to dream of having a car shop," Jacob said, working with the tools. He was focused, but his words carried a subtle note of regret. "You know, I always wanted to make something with my hands. Feel like I could handle it." I nodded. That was him. Always striving for something that required effort. Mechanics, cars. This had been his passion. He used to help me with repairs often, and I could see the spark in his eyes when something started working again. I understood that this gift, this drive to do something big in life, hadn't left him. It had just been hidden behind the heavy thoughts that occupied his mind now. "Why didn't you open a shop?" I asked as I continued to help him in the garage. I handed him a rag so he could clean the old frame from the dirt. He sighed, stopping for a moment. "I'm not sure. I always felt like I wouldn't have the courage to start something so important. And all these doubts, they're like shadows following me. I don't know if I can handle it." His words were full of uncertainty and fear about the future. I could feel the weight of those worries pressing on him. Jacob, who had once been so decisive, now didn't know what to do with his life. But I felt that in this moment, as he sat next to me, fixing the bike, it was a sign that he was looking for himself, that he hadn't lost faith in his ability to change something. "You know you can do it if you want to," I said. "Don't let those doubts control you. You've always been strong when you made up your mind." He looked at me and something new flashed in his eyes. Not confidence, but hope. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'll try after all." We continued working, and although the conversation was short, I felt that this moment was important. We couldn't solve everything at once, but in this moment, Jacob had taken the first step. It was a step toward himself, toward believing in his strength again. When we finished with the bike, Jacob stood up and looked at the result. "Not so bad," he said with a slight smile. "Not so bad, yeah," I replied, smiling back. And although we didn't know what would come next, I understood that Jacob was beginning to realize that he was capable of more than he thought. And that meant things could still change. In the evening, after we finished with the repairs, I suggested to Jacob that we take a walk along the river. It was a place I had loved since childhood. The calm water, the babbling of the streams, the trees reflecting in its surface. Everything reminded me of stability, of a time that moved slowly, as if it didn't rush to leave. I hoped that this evening by the river would help us both find answers to the questions that had been tormenting us. We walked in silence, with only the sound of our footsteps and the rustling of the leaves filling the space around us. Jacob had brought his guitar with him, an old one, slightly scratched but with the same familiar sound. Without saying a word, he took it out and began to play. The sounds were soft, reflective, as if he were seeking comfort in the music. I always remembered how he used to play when he was a child. Back when he would visit me, and despite his shyness, he would take out his guitar and sing something. Sometimes jokingly, sometimes seriously. He always played with his soul, and I knew that in those moments he was truly himself. Jacob played for a few minutes, absorbed in the music, but then suddenly fell silent. He looked at me, and there was a new light in his eyes. I felt that this moment had become something important, almost mystical. "You've always been the one who helped me dream, Aunt Kate," he said finally, without breaking his gaze. His voice was quiet but full of emotion. In those words, I heard something more than just gratitude. It was like a revelation, a recognition that he was still searching for his way. "You inspire yourself, Jacob," I replied, pausing for a moment. "I've always reminded you that you're capable of a lot, but you determine what happens next. You're the one who creates your own story." He didn't answer right away. We sat by the river, and I could see how his thoughts drifted somewhere far away again. He sat silently with the guitar in his hands, and I knew that in this moment, he was once again thinking about what lay ahead for him, about what he needed to decide. I didn't try to push him, didn't want to pressure him with my words. Sometimes the best thing we can do for those we care about is simply to be there, not expecting instant solutions. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any words. A few minutes passed before Jacob spoke again. "I'll think about it," he said quietly, but with a certain resolve in his voice. "I'll try to figure out what I want. Maybe I didn't understand all of this until recently, but now I want to change something." I smiled. In his words, there was not so much confidence, but a readiness to move forward despite all the doubts and fears. "You'll find your way, Jacob," I said with no hesitation. "Just don't rush. Time will put everything in its place." We continued sitting by the river, and despite the fogginess of the future, I felt that he had taken an important step. And though his path was still uncertain, he was ready to search. And that was already the beginning of change. In the morning, when I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee, Jacob was already ready. He was standing by his car, loading something into the trunk and looking at the house. I could see how he hesitated before turning to me, his gaze still filled with unspoken words. "Are you leaving?" I asked, trying to hide my sadness. Though we hadn't spent much time together, his presence had somehow changed my home, which was always filled with silence. He nodded, carefully closing the trunk. "Yeah, it's time. But, Aunt Kate, I've realized something these past few days. I need to go back home, figure things out, with the things I left unresolved." I felt the weight of the past few days, all the questions he had been searching for answers to, begin to lift. He might not have had clear answers, but he had taken a step in the right direction. Jacob no longer seemed lost. He was ready for change. And I believed that this wasn't the end of his journey, but the beginning of a new chapter. "You can always come back, Jacob," I said, standing up and walking towards him. "You know I'm here. And if you ever want to talk or just be here, you'll always have a place." He looked at me with gratitude, and his eyes filled with something bright, as if his heart had lightened just a little. "I promise I'll come back, not just to settle things, but also to be with you all. Thank you for giving me the time to figure things out." Those words sounded like a farewell, but not a final one. It was a promise he made not only to me, but also to himself. He spoke quietly, but there was something resolute in his voice that made me feel that he was ready to move forward, despite everything. I walked him to his car, watching as he got into the driver's seat. This goodbye was unlike any other I had experienced. I felt that a moment of change was coming into his life, and he was now ready to meet it. "Take care of yourself, Jacob," I said, as he turned the key in the ignition. "Remember, you're not alone." He nodded, and I saw sincere gratitude in his eyes. He smiled at me, a little sadly but sincerely, and his car rolled down the road, gradually disappearing around the bend. I stood on the porch, watching the road, feeling the warm sunlight embrace my house. Despite all the questions and uncertainties, I felt gratitude for the days we had spent together. Jacob's unexpected visit, his search, his doubts, all of it had brought something important into my life. And though I didn't know what would come next, I believed that everything would change for the better. I sat on the steps, took the last sip of my coffee, and thought. In my life, just like in Jacob's, change doesn't come immediately. But when it does, it takes us to something new, something important, even if we don't realize it yet. Jacob had left, but he had left a piece of his new hope in my home. And I knew that, despite all the difficulties, he would return. After Jacob left, the house filled with silence once again. I returned to my usual spot, the old chair on the porch with a cup of coffee in my hands, and as always, I gazed at the river. It was just as it always had been. Quiet, calm, reflecting the sky. But now, after Jacob had left our home, I saw it differently. It no longer seemed as familiar and unchanging. I felt that I, too, was changing, just like the river. Everything that had happened over the past few days had left its mark on me. I couldn't quite pinpoint what exactly had changed, but something inside me had shifted, as if this place, this house, had finally found new meaning. Jacob was gone, but I felt that his search, his words, and his silence had become a part of me. We both, each on our own path, had found something important. I sat on the porch, thinking about how sometimes unexpected visits can open up new horizons for us. Sometimes, all it takes is being there, just listening, and giving someone the chance to see their life from a different angle. In my case, Jacob helped me realize that I shouldn't fear change, that it's inevitable, but it can also be the source of something new and important. I had learned to trust myself more, and most importantly, the people who had once been part of my life. I looked at the river again. The water, as always, flowed calmly, and it became clear to me that no matter how circumstances unfolded, everything was in its place. My world, beyond the town, remained the same, but now there was something different in it. A sense of movement, hope, even if the path was not yet fully clear. While I sat on the porch, lost in thought, the cat came running up to my feet, meowing. I stroked her head and smiled. Everything would be all right. We all find our way, even when it's difficult. And sometimes that path begins with a small step taken at the right moment. So, with a cup of coffee in hand and the feeling that life continues to move forward, I remained sitting on the porch, watching the river. Perhaps everything would change, but that wasn't scary, because change is part of life. And it's those changes that help us see the world and ourselves in a new way. And in that, there was something truly important.